Okay, everybody, we're going to cover Chapter 3, Suffixes. This is another relatively short PowerPoint as well, but this chapter is extremely important, okay, because there are a number of pages in Chapter 3 that go through and list all the different kinds of suffixes. And so we'll go through some of the different rules that are associated with the suffixes, and then what those rules kind of entail as far as what it does to the word itself. Okay, so suffixes, remember, kind of from chapter 1, are added to the end of a word. Prefixes go to the beginning and suffixes go to the end. And just like the prefix, the suffix itself, the definition itself does not change. But once you add that suffix to the word root, then it does change the meaning of the word. Okay? And unlike prefixes, not every word has a prefix, but every word will have a suffix. Okay? Suffixes also can make a word either a noun or an adjective. And there are a few that talk about that in the book. The adjective suffixes are listed on page 43, and you'll find that pertaining to is a very common definition, and there are about 8 or 9 different suffixes that all mean pertaining to, okay? And once again, that's listed on page 43. And then we have some that we have the noun suffixes that are listed on page 41, okay? And so they are important because when you add those particular suffixes to the word root, it then makes it a noun, okay? And so when a suffix actually begins with a consonant, okay, something besides A, E, I, O, or U, then we have something called a combining vowel that needs to be attached, that needs to attach the suffix to the word root, okay? And so when we look at an example here, they have the word cephalodynia, and dynia means pain, and cephalo means head. Okay, so in this case, the root is cephal, or C-E-F-A-L. But because dynia begins with a consonant D, we have to use a vowel in between to link it. It can't be cephalodynia. And so when we have suffixes, that's why we have the dash O with all of our word roots, and that when we add that combining vowel, it becomes a combining form. Okay? So once again, when we have two consonants, or we have a consonant that our suffix starts with, then we have to add that combining vowel. The majority of the time, the combining vowel is O. Every once in a while, they'll use I, but the overwhelming majority of combining vowels are going to be O. Okay, so when we look at cephalodynia, the combining vowel O is needed because dynia begins with a consonant. Now, if we use the word cephalgia, algia also means pain. So you'll find that some of these suffixes, there's more than one suffix that means the same thing. And so in this particular case, algia also means pain. But algia begins with an A, so that particular suffix starts with a vowel. And so in that particular case, we don't need the combining vowel O. It wouldn't be cephaloalgia. We don't need that. So we can drop the O, and the word is cephalgia. Okay. So here it's just a little, some of these PowerPoints have questions in there. And so if we look at this question, to combine the word root lith means stone, and the suffix tripsy, which means crushing. If you put these two together, lith-tripsy, is that considered a valid term? So if we use the rules that we just saw on the prior page, tripsy begins with a T, which is obviously a consonant. And so we need to have that combining vowel between the two, between the word root and tripsy. So the term lith-tripsy is not a valid term. We need to have that O. Okay, so the word would actually be lithotripsy. Okay. All right, so one of the rules that we have to look at here when we're looking at suffixes, when you're actually reading or defining a medical term, we actually start, so if we're looking at our word, and if the word had a prefix, a word root, at a suffix, how would we read that? So we actually start with the suffix and then move to the front of the word. So when we're reading a medical term, we start with a suffix, then we go to the prefix second if it's there, and then the word root is read last. Now, if there's no prefix, then we just start with a suffix and go to the root word, okay? And there are some terms that are like that. So we talked about suffixes being adjectives, and they can also make the word a noun. Suffixes can also indicate specialties and or specialists. And so there's a couple listed here. The suffix that refers to a specialist in the field of study, ICIAN, like a geriatrician is the study of the elderly population. Ologist, or Logist, is one who specializes in the study of, and so that would be a dermatologist. They specialize in the study of skin. And then IATRIST is one who treats. So an example of that word would be a psychiatrist. That's one who treats someone that might have some sort of mental disorder. Okay? And so those all seem similar, and they are, but there's enough of a difference between it that we have to make sure that we know these word endings, okay? Because there are differences even though they are small differences. Suffixes can also indicate instruments. Scope is an instrument used to view, like a microscope is an instrument used to view objects that are smaller than what the naked eye can see. And then you have a meter is an instrument used to measure, like an oximeter is used to measure the oxygen saturation of oxygen within the blood. Okay, those particular ones I think are kind of listed in between the common suffixes. Okay, I think there is a spot on page 44 that talks about the specialists and specialties. If I go back, page 43 kind of addresses the first three, and then scope and meter and a number of other ones are listed on page 45 that talk about instruments, surgical, and diagnostic procedures. Okay. Okay, and this kind of is a follow-up to that last question too. All of these are listed on page 45. They can also indicate, suffixes can also indicate surgical and diagnostic procedures. Centesis is a surgical puncture, like an amniocentesis is a puncture within the amniotic fluid to measure that. Graphy is the process of recording, like an electrocardiography. Scopy, if you put the Y on the end of scope, it actually is the process of viewing with the scope, to where the scope itself is just the instrument used to view. And then TOMY is an incision into, like a craniotomy is an incision into the cranium. Okay. And so here we go, kind of doing a reading of a word. So if we have the word gastro, which means stomach, and the suffix plasty means surgical repair, how would you read the term gastroplasty? Okay, so remember, this goes back to our rule with suffixes, where we start, when we're reading the word, we start with the suffix, and then we go to the prefix, and then the word root. In this particular word, gastroplasty, we don't have a prefix, we only have a suffix and a word root. Okay, so gastroplasty would be the surgical repair of the stomach, okay, which basically is B, number B listed there. All right, this chapter also kind of looks at forming plurals. And so when we have these words, we have singular forms of words, and then we have plural forms. And so these endings are important because it really dictates and makes sure that we know what we're dealing with, okay? And there is a specific plural for each singular form, depending on what the endings are, okay? And so I'll kind of go through these. I know you can read these on your own, but I'll go ahead and just kind of read through them. There really isn't going to be a tremendous amount of these. We're doing an online course, and and we don't have any spelling tests, what have you, but there could be a couple of questions that might say what's the appropriate plural form of a particular word. And so going through this, there may be a couple. There's not going to be a lot, but it is important as you're going through the pronunciation of things as well. So when we have a singular form that ends in A, then when we go to a plural form, the ending changes to AE, okay? So if we have a plura, then we'd have plure, okay? When a singular form ends in AX, then you change the ending to ACES. So if we have a singular thorax, a plural thorax is thoraces. When you have a singular form that ends in IS, it changes to ES. So if we have the word diagnoses, which is when we actually come up with a diagnosis for someone, if we have multiple or more than one, the word is diagnosis, okay? ES. If we have a singular form of a word that ends in IX, EX, or YX, then that changes to ICES. So if we have a cervix, which is actually the neck of the uterus, or it can also refer to the cervical neck and the spine. If we have cervix, if we have multiple, we call it cervices. When we have a singular form of ON, then it actually changes to A. So an example of that would be a ganglion is a singular form, and if we have multiple, it's called ganglia. When a singular form ends in UM, then that UM changes to an A. So an example of that, a bacterium is a single bacteria. If we have more than that, it's bacteria. If we have a singular form that ends in US, then we change it to I. So an example of that would be a gyrus, which is a fold in the brain, and if it's multiple, it's called a gyri. And when we have a singular form that ends in MA, that MA is changed to mata. And so if we have a fibroma, which is actually a benign tumor in the uterus, then it would be, if it was a multiple tumors, they would call it fibromata. Okay, so once again, there won't be a lot of questions on that, but you'll see a lot of those pluralized forms on X-ray reports in reading, if you're going through EHR and reading diagnoses, and so that's why it's important to kind of have an idea of how those things are spelled and pronounced, okay? Question, true or false? Plural suffixes don't always follow a logical pattern, so it's important to study them. And I think after we just looked at that, we would definitely say that that's absolutely true, okay? So it's not a huge part of this course, but going through and familiarizing yourself with it will make it easier as you go through the medical field, okay? All right, so that kind of ends this particular chapter. It is short, so I kind of went through some of the pages that you'll be looking at. There's a couple of rules that are within here on page 40 and 41. I think I said this before, but page 41 has the noun suffixes. Page 43 has the adjective suffixes. Page 43 also goes through some of the common singular to plural suffix changes. 44 has the specialties and specialists. And then on 45, we have the instruments, surgical, and diagnostic procedures. And then 46 through 50 is sort of just a meshed graph or view out of all of them. So there's the ones that we covered plus some extra ones in there. So it's important to go through everything in green in these chapters because all of these definitions are important. When you do your homework, I do like to see if there is a suffix or a prefix or a word root that has more than one definition. I like to see everybody put all of the ones that are listed here because it does make it a little bit easier as you're going through, because sometimes the definition is more appropriate in one word and sometimes it's, you know, if you've got two, it depends on what you're dealing with. So keeping 2, 3, or 4 of those definitions in your mind is important. The chapter review exercises are here. Remember that those answers are in Canvas within its own module. And so don't forget to utilize this as a studying guide to go through and do all the chapter review exercises as as you go through the PowerPoints and as you go through and read through the chapter and take notes. Go ahead and do these chapter review exercises. The answers are in there. And then from that point on, you can start using the Quizlets to start studying, okay? But that's a good resource, okay? So I'll go ahead and turn this off, and we'll get started on the next chapter in just a minute, okay?